Thank you very much for the privilege of speaking with you today. I'm delighted to be with you digitally at this memorable and interesting time. I'm sitting on the floor in my son's bedroom because this is the quietest place in the house. Hopefully we're not disturbed. I'm really humbled to have this opportunity to share some tools for difficult conversations that have been useful in my life. First, I'll explain where I'm coming from, the experiences that have shaped my worldview. Then I'll explain the way of openness, which is a set of conventions for productive dialogue. Finally, I'll leave you with some thoughts from where I am right now into my third bout of chemotherapy and in the middle of a global pandemic. We all have different experiences that shape who we are and what we think about the world, how we think about the world. Sometimes these experiences stretch back before our birth. My mother's name was Susan Lou Inouye. Here she is on her wedding day at the Los Angeles Temple of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She was a third-generation Chinese American. Her mother, Margie, my grandmother, was born on a farm in Salt Lake City, Utah. Margie's parents had come to the United States from the Pearl River Delta in Guangdong, China. In Salt Lake City, they grew vegetables on a large farm. They got along well with their closest neighbors, the Sorensens, and became members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The Sorensen boys worked for my great-grandfather to pay for their church missions. But not everybody saw my family as sisters and brothers. Other kids in the neighborhood threw rocks at my grandmother and her siblings as they walked to school. They shouted, "Chink, chink, go back to China." After World War II, my grandmother's family eventually moved to Orange County, California. It was mostly orange groves then. They farmed land in what is now Buena Park. My grandfather Margie married Hall Lu, a Navy veteran and UCLA engineering student. Margie and Hall ran a Chinese restaurant in Westwood, where actors in Hollywood westerns came in for lunch still wearing their cowboy costumes. My mother was born in Fountain Valley. My father is Warren Sanji Inouye, also third generation, a Japanese American. He was born in Richfield, Sanpete County, Utah. His parents were Nisei, second generation Japanese Americans from California and Washington State. Their parents, my great-grandfather Sashichi and great-grandmother Mikano, met and married in Hawaii in the early 20th century. The family later moved to Mountain View, California. My grandfather, Charles Inouye, was one of the early Japanese American graduates of Stanford University. World War II unleashed a wave of racism and nativism in the United States. White Americans looked at their fellow Japanese American citizens, and saw the enemy. In the West Coast, many had long resented Japanese Americans' participation in the economy and coveted their farms and businesses. On February 19, 1942, Franklin D. Roosevelt issued an executive order to evacuate all persons of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast and imprison them deep in the interior. Over 110,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of them born and raised U.S. citizens, were loaded into trucks and buses with a suitcase in each hand. They had been forced to abandon their homes, farms, and businesses at an estimated loss of $1 to $3 billion. That's not adjusted for inflation. Their properties were looted, their places of worship vandalized. First, they were sent to assembly centers like the Santa Anita racetrack, where they were housed in horse stalls. Then they boarded trains away from the coast. At the camp in Heart Mountain, Wyoming, my grandparents and great-grandparents lived under the gaze of armed sentries on watchtowers. The tar paper-covered barracks were made of green wood that shrank to leave large gaps. Each barracks block had a room with showers and a long row of toilets with no partitions between them. My family made the best of the conditions. My Auntie Jeanette was in Girl Scouts. My Uncle Frank played in the band. My Grandpa Charles Inouye and Grandma Bessie Murakami met because they were both teachers in the Buddhist Sunday school. Their first baby, my Uncle Dylan, was born in camp. At this time, the government mandate was that anyone with 1/16 Japanese blood had to be locked up. I'm half Japanese, and my children are a quarter. I wonder, what would it have been like for us as military trucks packed me and my husband and 4 children off to live for months in a single horse stall? In this age of self-quarantine, we are better able to imagine how it felt to be confined. But we at least are in homes with bathrooms, kitchens, and the internet, not horse stalls that had been whitewashed in such haste. Clumps of manure had been encased in the walls, breaking open like sores when you touch them. What would I have done if I had not been targeted myself, and if I had learned that my neighbors were being forced to abandon their thriving crops and businesses to live behind barbed wire? Would I have raised my voice and stood outside the halls of power? Would I have been my sister's and brother's keeper? People living in a historic moment do not feel historic. The score of small choices constantly at hand just feels like everyday life, like common sense. What to do on the coming weekend, where to look for a place to live, whom to invite in, whose problems to make one's own. Historian Robert Schaffer studied the few individuals in the state of Washington who did stand up on behalf of their Japanese neighbors. Often these individuals had prolonged contact with Japanese or Japanese Americans as educators, missionaries, or members of Christian churches. Emma Azalea Pete, a Methodist who had been a missionary in Japan for 25 years, spoke out forcefully against removal at government hearings held before the evacuation decision was made, quote, demanding that evidence of wrongdoing by Japanese Americans be presented for the government before the government moved to deprive U.S. citizens of their civil liberties, close quote. Reverend Emory Andrews, the pastor of the Japanese Baptist Church in Seattle, declared, quote, future historians will record this evacuation, this violation of citizenship rights, as one of the blackest blots on American history, as a time that democracy came the nearest to being wrecked, close quote. Reverend Andrews and his family sought unsuccessfully for permission to live inside the prison camp at Minidoka, alongside the members of their congregation in the Japanese Baptist Church. When this failed, they moved to Idaho to be closer to the Minidoka camp. Reverend Andrews made over 50 trips back and forth to Seattle, about 700 miles each way, to deliver goods out of storage to the internees. He also brought out the automobiles of those who had arranged to move further east. In 1944, he wrote to a WRA official, quote, by evacuation of this minority group, we have said to every other minority group and to the whole world two things, that our Constitution and its principles are null and void, and that the military has precedence over civil rights. When these efforts to prevent removal failed, people like Floyd Schmo, a Quaker, worked to, as he put it, ease the blow upon our neighbors by helping to arrange the safe storage of their possessions, leasing of their lands, businesses, hotels, etc. L.P. Sieg, president of the University of Washington, allowed Japanese American students who had been compelled to evacuate before finishing their final quarter of university studies to receive their university degrees. He traveled to the camps to bestow each one of these degrees in person. Catholic priest L.H. Tibesar published a full-page feature article in the Seattle Times in 1943, protesting the poor living conditions in the camps. Referring to Franklin D. Roosevelt's wartime rallying call of establishing the four freedoms abroad through an Allied victory, he said, we cannot export what we do not have at home. Despite the heightened fear and anger and racial divisions of the age that led the majority of Americans to set aside their ideals of liberty and justice for all, these few good neighbors worked to lay the foundations for a better day, seeking to improve public attitudes towards Japanese Americans so that when the camps closed, people would be more accepting. Over and over again, these few good neighbors waded into difficult conversations, sharing their personal experiences of trust and friendship with Japanese Americans. They persistently stood up to offer people around them other ways of thinking, doing, and being. I grew up in Orange County, California, a beneficiary of the trust-building efforts of these kind neighbors and the hard work and determination of my parents and grandparents. I went to school, played soccer, took piano lessons. My mom was in the PTA. My dad was our local scoutmaster. And then there was church. As far back as I can reach into my childhood, the Latter-day Saints are there. At birthday parties, on Sunday mornings, on Sunday nights, on Wednesday nights for youth activities, all day on Saturday to help someone move, at innumerable performances and practices and graduations. They are stoking the campfire beneath the tall pines of the Sierras and scrambling up the coarse rock formations of Joshua Tree. They are performing at piano recitals. My teacher was the ward organist, and lip syncing under the sea on the stage of the ward talent show. All these activities involve organization, people working side by side, taking direction, but also taking initiative to plan and coordinate. It was at church that I first learned how to be an activist, as I observed my mother, father, and other volunteer leaders. To massively mix metaphors, I saw how they herded cats, tamed beasts, got back in the saddle, cut the Gordian knot, and marshaled the troops. All these people working together with their hands were incredibly powerful. In a few hours of a day, a pack of us could clean and paint an entire school building or plant an entire neighborhood with trees. We could swarm through a patch of woodland like eco-locusts, snapping the necks of weeds and tearing up invasive plants by their roots. There should be a specialized plural noun to describe them. A mob of Mormons, a sanctum of saints, a heap of helping hands. This phenomenon probably exists in other religious groups too, so we should think of plural nouns for them too, like a bevy of Buddhists, a union of Unitarians. Religious communities of all stripes have tremendous power beyond literal helping hands because in addition to physical gathering, they have a strong ideological and moral orientation. Members of such communities believe in things that are not sane, but that are real and true and important. They believe in righteousness. They value honesty and integrity. Together, communities built around morality dare to define standards of right and wrong, though they often disagree about details. Working with our minds and hearts as well as hands, communities held together by strong beliefs have tremendous influence. As a Latter-day Saint, in my religious community, I have seen the power of people acting together to aid their neighbors, often with elbow grease or casseroles with lots of cheese, but also with shared experiences and a listening heart. Precisely because right and wrong are universally important, but also deeply personal, often it's difficult to have conversations about ethics or ethical issues. We may agree that honesty and integrity are important, but what does this look like in practice and policy? We all espouse values such as fairness, loyalty, and kindness. But what do we do when someone claiming those same values proposes a course of action that is the opposite of the course we would take?